Generally what I wanted to talk about was this progression of software into this blockchain world, and try to get back to the basics of why we're here. Because going to some of the events lately, I've been a little bit frustrated and annoyed with the fact that everything feels like they're trying to train us. Every single talk that I've seen lately is trying to train the audience of how to be a junior banker, and how to follow these rules that were in fact precisely the reason that this technology came to be as powerful as it is becoming. And the fact that when I got into this, I didn't get in it to figure out the rules of the banking world or the SEC or money transfer or any of these things that just seem to be so central to all the discussion right now. And lately I've gotten into a lot of thinking about all of it, and the fact that back in the early 2000s, Mark Andreessen, right, Netscape, early investor in a lot of what is out there today in the internet, said basically software is eating the world, right? That every single thing that software is applied to is being disrupted, with the efficiencies increasing, lots of money coming in, precisely because you can actually automate and repeat things that used to be done on paper by people, so on. Very simple concept, but in early 2000s, that's what drove everything. And yet, with software, you have to have human leadership. You have to have a group of people who get together to actually build something, knowing what's needed, and a lot of it's a guess, and you pivot and you find what actually resonates, and then you sell it, right? And it grows, and if you can scale, you become a big company, value with real value. And yet that requires that human element, a really proactive, rare thing that people have the energy and the funding to build what they want to build that would be disruptive, right? And then you move forward and you see, Bitcoin. And I don't know if any of you have had this, but very typically you'll talk to the people that might be late in coming into the sphere, especially engineers, will cite that no element of Bitcoin was actually novel, right? It was a combination of things that everything already existed. The crypto existed, the hash power itself existed, the currencies existed, but in combination, it's an extremely powerful technology. And when you look at why it is, when they first started actually building out, getting adoption on the network, the tokens for at least a while were, seemingly worthless. No one knew what you could do with them, right? So you could go back to that point in time and say, well, I don't want to worry about currency. I just want to secure a network with hash power, and you can do that. But if I come in and I something more like a BitMessage or something, if I hash my message because I want to secure it on this blockchain that is otherwise without currency, there's not a real driver. I don't have a driver to hash anyone else's messages, right? So it's that application of a token to the component that makes this this marketplace capability possible, and that's what I think of as the purest part of why cryptocurrencies work, and why the hash power. How do you secure the network, and then how do you reward nodes or people or companies for providing that hash power or the staking or whatever else is approved to secure the network. And so when you tie that back to what Andreessen said, it becomes this interesting thing that with the addition of a marketplace component to software, it can be self-driving, right? I mean, Bitcoin didn't have an IBM to usher it through. It didn't have Bank of America to say, this is what we should do, and even to get a standards organization to say, this is how we should handle it. It wasn't driven by that at all. It wasn't driven by government. It wasn't driven by large organizations coming together in a committee and deciding, here is how we best should do this, right? Because that never happened. It was a single person, right? At least we don't know who, but that put this together and a marketplace that drove it, right? That early adoption, obviously hard, but once something is tested and there is a marketplace component, it is a very interesting way to build software, because it's kind of like an expansion on, like say with Linux and open source, and how more eyes, more capability, but that doesn't even have a driver. That still requires individuals and organizations doing the early strategic funding of something. This is something where all of that can actually be driven, of course decentralized, but by the actual adopters. That if I have a properly tuned cryptocurrency or blockchain option or alternative to something I'm already doing in my business, it becomes an interesting thing, because, yeah, I mean, everyone realizes, oh, I might get disrupted, so I need to figure out what do I do with blockchain. That's happening a lot, especially in the bigger organizations. But the thought that adoption can actually be driven not by convenience and cost, but by this proactive, I can actually profit from disrupting myself, from moving into that way of doing things. And it's just an interesting component that I think is the it's the core feature of what we're looking at and what we're trying to build. Where we want software that's tunable in a way for any industry or any business idea, that you could drive the adoption and more importantly drive the actions of that network. That is, if I reward certain things in business with my engineering groups, I'm more likely that they are going to do what I want them to do. And the fact that you can cook that in to an actual software system by attaching a cryptocurrency, it becomes really interesting. And we did a lot of that in a large organization that we built actual prototypes in, and it was extremely interesting because we would tend to get the groups come to us for transparency, where they knew all these activities were going on, but they really didn't know, they had no metrics, they had no way to know what some other group was doing in relation to delivering what they needed. So all of these problems were always there. So they came to us for transparency, but when we would apply a currency piece to the system, it was always interesting because they could actually then, they could decide what needed to be rewarded. They could see how the system was being gamed. They could make adjustments. And that's a lot of what we focused on, which then gets into the hybrid blockchain that, that's what we do at Dragonchain. And the reason is because all of those verticals you can think of that are disrupted in the software, with software, I would give a good portion of them can't be built on a public blockchain. Part of them can be built. Like say you could say, oh, I can take my financial system, and I obviously can put part of it on a blockchain, and the parts, I can integrate in a way that makes sense, where it's security focused or transparency focused or something, but I can't actually put your financial records on one of these public platforms. I can't put your health data on one of these public, and that's just where it's regulated. You can go in, and any real business isn't going to put their customer data and the monies related to those customers on a public blockchain, because it's too risky, it's too dangerous, and it's too hard. I mean, software is hard anyway. It's hard to deliver a system without decentralization, without game theory, without economy, without a currency, right? So if it's hard to build a system as it is and actually make it usable, useful, valuable in production, you consider now, let's go to a Fortune 500 and we say, we're going to take X system, and typically it can be something really small, but how likely is it, especially in an organization like that where everything's run by committees typically, right, and where all these political situations that occur? It's not a single person, it's not some club of friends building this, and you go to them and say, okay, I'm going to build this for you. Tell me everything about your economy. Tell me what drives the people precisely, mathematically, not anything squishy at all. What are the rules? How will people game this if you are giving them a token for every time they do this action, right? They're going to find easier ways to do that action. You're going to get bots actually doing that action. You're going to have all these things happen. And so on all of the platforms existing at the time that I wrote the Dragonchain architecture, it was a one time, like, well, just make the best guess you can. Hopefully you're right. The simple is better, less is more. The fact that why is Bitcoin still successful? Because it's extremely simple. There's nothing in there generally that isn't absolutely needed, or at least wasn't some portion of something that was intended to be built in. But you try to make anything complex, and real software systems are complex. The data coming in is complex. The interactions between people are remarkably complex, because it's not a one-dimensional thing. It's you have organizations, you have people, you have all these different players, and to ask them to do that on a typical full public blockchain, proof of stake, proof of work, doesn't matter, isn't going to happen, right? And so what happened? IBM comes in with Hyperledger, right? And so it makes sense, because a banker can get it. They don't have to worry about the issues I just described generally, and yet you don't have the hash power, right? So it's always this major frustration where there was nothing in the middle, and so my intent in doing what we did was to make it possible at one level to isolate and say, okay, this is your world. We still have we have all the blockchain capabilities and components. However, you don't have to apply a currency, you don't have to apply a proof. I mean, it's like, well, what's the value of it, right? And the value is, and I would agree, that's not that valuable by itself. It's interesting. It's not even necessarily that novel, with transactional systems, but the nice part of the hybrid model itself is that any given action on that otherwise limited value chain can be thrown into a public blockchain to leverage the hash power, the staking, whatever, and to do it successively, automated, where the user doesn't have to worry about it. It makes it very interesting, because I get all the features without needing to be an expert in them. Take one, I have the flexibility to actually run multiple currencies or no currencies at all, or to actually have different classes of currency, where I might have one that's actually running on Ethereum or Neo, and I might have one or two that are running internally to my organization. You know, they're not on any public exchange. They're not a standardized public token, and the value in that and the power is what I'm really interested in right now, because we're seeing the ability, and a lot of it right now is almost deprogramming, where when we go to a particularly large organization, they only know what they've been told in the press and or by consultants. And so they think I either have to be a fully decentralized anarchist in their minds, right? Or I have to be I have to go to IBM, right? And so hopefully I'm not stepping on toes there. But one way or another, that it's an interesting thing, because when we're talking to them, we're realizing that they are interested in actually applying and trying to figure out what they can selectively expose, what they can do to actually scale this. And you know, right now, I think the biggest concern we have, I mean, all of the business input that we're getting, feedback, and all of the partnerships we're working on, really valuable. But there's this concern with the regulatory side of everything, right? And you know, being a U.S. company, it's frustrating because we have to pull back on a lot of things that we're actively trying to build, and we have to spend a lot of money on legal that we wouldn't like to spend, right? It's just one of those things where we're, you know, trying to line everything up and make sure we're, you know, running everything properly, and yet it's an interesting thing, because it's easy to follow the rules, but it's really hard to follow the rules that are not really rules yet, right? So I have to do something today that I have to hope in 6 months isn't called out as, oh, we don't want you to do this anymore, or in the past, you know, and that, you know, the anymore is fine, but in the past becomes really hard for a business to function, right? And so a lot of our concern is with, you know, this is going to be a big technology. I mean, it already is, right? And you know, in a ramp up with, you know, prior to some of the regulatory clamping recent, that, how do I say, it was obvious the value. I mean, I think anybody who was sufficiently paying attention generally didn't lose money in most of those. You know, there were a lot of obvious scams. There were a lot of projects that were not necessarily obvious scams, but you know, generally it's a successful way to do fundraising. But it's, well, how do I say? I mean, as big as it's going to get, we're afraid that it's going to be forced out of the U.S. because there are too many unknowns, right? And that's where we're struggling right now, because we've committed to being a U.S. company and to doing what we plan to build to do so. Anyway, we're worried about that, and otherwise everything's good. I'm done. Do you guys, anybody have questions?
Yeah, okay. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about the challenge that you have with enterprises that do or don't want to get certain data onto chains, even if they're private, and then how you connect it back to the public chains and why they do or don't do those things.
Okay. So anybody heard more about the challenge on how to segregate data and how to protect sensitive data?
Yep.
Okay, so that's core to our platform. That's the fun part of what we do, because we'll get someone that comes to us who knows there's some value in the technology and knows that they need some particular aspect of it. You think a lot of it, particularly with sensitive material, a lot of times there is an audit component. So who changed this, who accessed it, why is it in the current state that it is in right now? And there might be legal or other aspects of why they're looking at it, legal, financial, whatever. With blockchain, you can prove it. But the problem is they can't actually do it, because if they do it in a way that's hypersensitive info, I can't put it on a public blockchain. So it's obvious you can hash it into Bitcoin, right? But it's not something that's built into most systems, and it's not so native to an enterprise mind, right? That's not something that is a typical component. And so, core part of our platform is you build on this business node that you have. It's basically all the same DevOps best practices as building a web service for the past 20 years have been. And yet, you have these currency components. You have the ability to selectively take some small part of your business logic and run it on a public chain. So if I want to expose a particular extremely simple process so that you and everyone else in the world knows that I'm not cheating when I'm doing this, even though I'm not doing it within full view of the public. So that becomes amazing. But then you also have this, that every single thing you do, from the tiniest, most insignificant operation that you don't know what the value of in 5 or 10 years, right? All I know is, Bobby paid Sue, or Billy changed this document. That's all I know. I have no idea today whether that's important, right? And that's the beauty of it, because on the one side of it, having it in place and having it checkpointed, in our system through validation, through network check, through an external notary, and then into Bitcoin or Ethereum or Neo or some other public chain, that I can decide for myself when I'm looking at 5 years, say I'm a judge or I'm your accountant, I'm auditing your books, I can actually look at that record and know, first of all, that it's not very likely that you would have known at the time that this little part of the puzzle would be important, so you wouldn't likely have faked it. And it would cost you to have faked it, and all these other elements. And we have some interesting special sauce as well for how to measure the likelihood that you actually faked it, or would ever wanted to fake it. And so we're working on all those things. But that's, I guess probably the biggest issue is the mindset, and I guess it's with everything. It's how do you convince someone that this is, it's different but better or true or fits what you need, right? Long answer.
Yes.
Oh, same thing?
Yeah.
Right on, okay. Same question, all right. So, I don't know, that's what we do, and that's again, that's the fun part of it, because we're actually able to see things on a blockchain that haven't been considered to be put on a blockchain prior, in particular with some level of decentralization or multiple currency aspect, where there are a lot of interesting things, like say, as an example, with our interchain stuff, the fact that I can watch something on Ethereum, just a token transfer, or a smart contract itself, some result, and I can take action on Dragonchain, so I can do my own things in my enterprise based upon that activity. I can also then push something, and I can do something on, let's say Neo or Ethereum Classic, and maybe I'm using Ethereum Classic because the fees are low, and I'm doing this so remarkably often that I don't need the extra hash power that I get with Ethereum, but I need lower cost. So, but I don't know where it's going yet, but I'm starting to see potential patterns for the equivalent of RESTful interchange across blockchains, where you know, if you know about how REST works, and you know, the web services or the internet itself, right? It's an architecture that describes the internet where I'm not, it's a stateless environment where in the ideal world, I will take a message and I will send it to your server, and that's the end of it. And then your response will be a response based upon, you know, nothing that is stored on the, how do I say, nothing, no state that is stored on the server. Ideally, I don't have a session where I'm interacting with the server. It is that I give you a state, you do some processing, you return a state, I do some processing, you know, the user might click a link, I give you a state, and it's transferring back and forth. And so the ability to do that on blockchains is really interesting, because the fact that architecture is what made the internet itself so flexible, right? That nobody expected, and then the funny thing is it leads back to the same interesting communications that I still see all the time, and I've seen since, you know, when we were at Disney. It was very much that we would have engineers who were brilliant engineers come to us and say, where is it not good to use blockchain? You know, where do we want to avoid thinking about using blockchain? You know, where is the good? And it was always an interesting, you know, step back and think about it philosophically. It's in my mind the same question that you had early internet. You know, is it a good question? You know, in the early '90s to have asked, what should we not use the internet for? You know, should we not sell books? Should we not do e-commerce? Should we not do video, right, on the internet? And you know, any answer that you could have given in the negative would have been wrong, right? Almost entirely. There might be some cases that you shouldn't do certain things, but generally it wasn't intended to be, you know, making this for this particular reason so you can sell books, right? It very much was, you know, platform, and that's the way I've seen blockchain, even early days. I mean, that you know, Satoshi himself mentioned the possibility of Namecoin, right? Which I really wanted Namecoin to work because there's so many really good, interesting use cases where you can tie your SSL to your domain name, where you can actually control your domain name, not have to go through some centralized organization. So one way or another, I see the whole thing as a platform, and that there will be, it's almost like websites, and you know, you will have specific platforms, and you'll have very specific tokens that are use cases that are, in my mind, equivalent to a website in the '90s. You know, very likely to fail, but you know, if it does succeed, it'll be pretty big. So anyway, good. Thank you.